Not many have heard of developmental dysplasia of the hip or DDH. However, lots of people probably recognise the term clicky hips or remember having their baby's hips checked at birth and at their 6-week check. Unfortunately for us, Erin, my third daughter, passed those hip checks, but actually did have a dislocated hip and went on to have lots of treatment over the course of sort of 18 months. So I just thought I'd talk a little bit about what the signs of DDH are. So Erin was normal birth, born at normal gestation, absolutely passed all of her development checks. However, as she got a bit older, she was late to crawl. She didn't move at all at 9 months, which I raised with the health visitors. And it was then noticed that Erin had an extra crease in her legs. Basically, if you lie a baby on their tummy and have their legs together, their creases should match up. I never knew that. I never had been told that. You know, I'm already a mum of 2. I didn't know that. That is a symptom of DDH. It doesn't mean all babies that have that extra crease will go on and have DDH, but it is something that if you notice in your baby's legs that you should certainly mention, especially if there are other symptoms which I'm going to talk about. Erin also was late to crawl. She didn't like weight bearing. If you stood her, she would pull up her legs. You know, she just didn't like that bouncing on your legs, or if anybody held her, she didn't put her feet to the floor. Again, you know, repeated trips to the doctor, they just said that she would get there eventually. Erin got to 18 months, she still wasn't walking. I wasn't too worried. She was later than my other 2, but, you know, I still didn't realise the significance of these different symptoms together. When Erin was 20 months, she did start walking and she had a limp. And now this limp is because her hip socket hadn't formed properly, so her legs were different lengths. So the limp was an immediate sign. Again, taken to GP, fast forwarded on to physio. Physios couldn't really see much wrong. And then Erin was referred back to our GP. I insisted on a paediatric assessment and she was diagnosed with a dislocated hip in the waiting room. Basically, the paediatrician watched her walk and just said to me straight away, I know what's wrong with her. The only way to have it identified is an x-ray at that age. Ultrasound in babies and then an x-ray in toddlers. So we went for an x-ray and yes, Erin's hip was dislocated. The hip is a cup and ball socket. So your femur sits in the socket. For Erin, her femur was displaced, but also her socket was very, very shallow, you know, like a saucer rather than the cup. So her hip femur was moving around. This meant that she needed an operation to create that socket. So for Erin, she spent 18 weeks in a body cast that went from her just below her belly button to her ankles on both legs with a bar in between. Devastating, absolutely devastating to watch your child be put in a plaster cast that's so restrictive. You know, she had just started walking and suddenly we took that away from her within, you know, a very, very short space of time. Erin's closed reduction, as that's called, when her legs were just manipulated into position, she had a little snip just to release a tendon and then she went in the plaster cast. That wasn't enough for Erin because she'd been diagnosed so late. So we then had a further operation after 18 weeks called a Salter's osteotomy, where she had bone grafts that took her hip socket and made it deeper, and her femur, she was pinned into place for the period of another 6 weeks while that healed. Having a toddler in a body cast, known as a spiker, is incredibly difficult. I had to take a sabbatical off work for a year to look after her. That obviously has financial implications. We were lucky that we could afford to do this, but you know, we did go without for that year. The emotional impact still goes on. You know, watching your child, excuse me, in a body cast means that you watch their peers doing things that your child can't, and that lasts for a long time, because even after Erin had the cast taken off, you know, she was back at square one. So at 3 years old, I had a child that couldn't walk, a child that was still in pain, and even now, you know, she's not as strong as her peers in terms of her physical development. Academically, she's flying, but physically, we have leg pains all the time. She's still under constant checkups. She has regular x-rays to ensure that her growth and her bones are developing. The likelihood is that she will need more operations in the future. She's likely to need a hip replacement at a much younger age than you would expect. She has a scar that runs down her leg, which doesn't bother her at all, and it's healing really well, but you know, it's that badge, it's a constant reminder of what she's been through. This is the cheeky little munchkin. This was just after she had come out of class, actually, and one of the first times we went on a day trip, and she was learning to walk. This photo was taken in hospital just after she had the second cast taken off, and they happened to have the Olympic torch on the ward, so we were really pleased to be able to get to hold that and have some photos taken with us and the badge. But you know, hip dysplasia, it needs to be recognised. It needs to be recognised much sooner. You know, our health professionals are just missing it. There isn't enough training. I've spoken to training midwives now to highlight them to what the symptoms are. But you know, I think it's just one of the biggest miscarriages out there at the moment. There are many babies like Erin that I know of that haven't been identified until they're 2, you know, 1.5, 2, and it's just too late. If a baby is diagnosed with hip dysplasia at birth or the 6-week check, 95% will be fixed by wearing a Pavlik harness, and that's a cloth type harness, no operations involved. They simply places their legs in the best position, and it stays. They wear this constantly for, you know, maybe up to 12 weeks, but for 95% of babies that will stop any long-term problems, and we never had that chance. And because we never had that chance, Erin has been to theatre 7 times. 7 times I've watched her be gassed and put to sleep so they can operate or change a cast on her. 7 times she has been in recovery, crying in pain. She's been scared when she wakes up and she's in a body cast. You know, and this shouldn't be happening. Our children deserve better, and the signs and the symptoms are there for some children, and you know, parents need to be told what these signs are and you know what to look for. So just to recap, if your child has that extra crease that I mentioned at the beginning, that can be a symptom. If your child is reluctant to weight bear, that can be a symptom. If your child, when you pull up their knees are not level. Now, if you imagine you lie on your back, feet on the floor, so your knees like that, you should see they should be straight across. Again, if there is a difference in the knee height, that is a symptom. It shows that the hip socket might not be in the right position, that the femur might not be sitting nicely in that socket. So if you recognise any of those signs, you know, or you have any concerns, clicking, clunking of the hip, you know, we never had the clicks because Erin's hip was so dislocated that there was nothing for it to click against. You know, her socket wasn't developed enough. But for some, it might be a reduced movement when you're changing nappies. Okay, if one leg doesn't go as far as the other, that too can be a sign of hip dysplasia. You know, if you hear clunking when you're changing a nappy, that can be a sign of hip dysplasia. So, you know, I'm doing everything I can to raise awareness of what are some of the symptoms of hip dysplasia. if you want to see more, including some videos of Erin in her spiker cast, you know, have a look on my YouTube channel. I've got some examples of Erin walking with her limp, plus examples of her moving about in her body cast, and also some of the post-op stuff that she went through as well. Thank you for listening, and do make sure that you're aware of hip dysplasia.